Chapter 38, The Harvest. You've noticed that the novel is divided into four sections: spring, winter, summer, and fall. And it represents the cycle of seasons, which the grapes follow, just like our life cycle. And as we always say, there's a time for everything under the vine. So this section is the beginning of the autumn section. So it's chapter 34, The Harvest, everything that the winemakers have been waiting for. You can't make good wine from bad grapes, Lum taught winemakers in his class, but you sure as hell can make bad wine from good grapes. Paul knew what bad wine tasted like once he got his smell back, because he had made so much of it. He began to see the key performance metric of his job description as not screwing it up, a good winemaking rule to live by. Since starting with good grapes is key, picking grapes at their optimum ripeness is critically important. When is the best time to harvest? When your partner tells you, Paul said in jest, even as he tried his best to explain the numbers to Sheila. The numbers start with picking a sample. Carrie Ann did the math, calculating if there were 1 million grapes in her vineyard, with a random sample of 384 berries, she could determine the Brix with 95% confidence. Do you know how long it takes to pick 384 grapes? Paul told Sheila. We can pull 5 berries from 12 rows and get a pretty good idea of what their sugars are. Let's go. It was the first week in August, and together with Bluey they picked 60 berries, careful not to pinch one with a yellow jacket inside. Put them into a baggie, squished them inside the sealed bag, poured the juice into a shot glass. Paul offered to Sheila. How does it taste? He asked. Very sweet, she answered. Let's pick next week. How high do you think the Brix are? Almost 24, she guessed. Let's see, he said, inserting his finger into the glass, dabbing juice from his finger onto the glass plate of a refractometer, a device to measure sugar, reminding Sheila she needed to check hers. He pulled the ocular lens of the refractometer to his eye and held it towards the light and saw the number. Only 21 Brix, said Paul. We've got at least 2 weeks to go. Let's check the acid and pH. So he lifted the shot glass to the probe of the pH meter, which showed 3.1, indicating the grapes were not yet ripe. Then they tested the acid, which was high at 0.85, another indicator the grapes were underripe, with Paul experiencing the tartness in his cheeks when he sipped the juice. They took another sample a week later, and as the happy vines enjoyed warm days and cool nights, ripening proceeded slowly, and Paul set a tentative harvest date 2 weeks hence, notifying friends and crew to save the date. That evening, while streaming Netflix videos of Mount Everest expeditions on his phone, Paul fell asleep on the living room couch and dreamed. Narrator. To prepare for the attempt to the summit, Paul and the other vintners must acclimate themselves by entering the vineyard and climbing into the death zone to build strength. The death zone is the time between 12 p.m. and 4 p.m. in August, with temperatures above 40 degrees centigrade. Paul has been in the death zone longer than planned and is showing signs of weakness. The commander at base camp wants him to return before he becomes injured or worse. Commander. Paul, how do you feel? Over. Paul. Really tired. It's so hot. The wind is blowing 20 miles per hour, but I have to keep going. Commander. You need to come back. You've run out of water. Your body is dehydrating. Over. Narrator. Paul is showing classic signs of vineyard fever and doesn't know it. He wants to stay in the vineyard and finish the task, but each minute he spends outside above 40 degrees is a minute closer to death. Paul. I'm fine. Just give me 30 more minutes, that's all. I've got to finish hanging the nets. Commander. Paul. You're running dangerously low on water. You've been outside over 4 hours, and I've calculated you don't have enough water to make it back to base camp. You're dehydrated. You're putting your life and the lives of your teammates and the Sherpas in danger. I can't allow that. You must turn around. We've got water here at base camp. Come on down the mountain. Rest, and you can return to the vineyard tomorrow. Over. Narrator. Paul, now turned around and heading down the mountain to base camp. Slowly, puts one foot in front of the other, and makes it safely down. Commander: Paul's mountaineering skills are lacking, and he's a liability to the team. I'm concerned that on harvest day, if he's in the death zone and something goes wrong, he'll be little use to the rest of the team repairing a broken water pipe or fixing the broken motor of the crusher destemmer. Still, he's got a lot of heart and drive. His teammates like him, and so do the Sherpas. I think I'll keep him on the team, and I'll pair him with the strongest Sherpa so he can make it. Narrator: Summit morning, 4 a.m. The cook has stayed up all night preparing meals for the Sherpas, and Paul managed to get 3 hours sleep. At 5 a.m., the Sherpas arrive at Paul's tent, nibble on dried goat meat, serve him water, then head out of camp towards the summit. As the sun rises, so do the temperatures, but because they have acclimated to 100 Fahrenheit degrees, the morning temperature of 65 Fahrenheit feels cool to the vintner and to the grapes. At last, Paul has reached the topmost vine at the summit, cuts a bunch of grapes, and lifts it over his head, his Sherpa taking a photo of the moment. Paul, how does it feel to reach the summit? This has been a lifetime goal for me, something I've always wanted to do. Narrator: What made you want to do it? Paul: I've always been attracted to great challenges in my life. Nothing is harder than owning a vineyard and getting through the harvest. I want to thank my parents. Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. Narrator: Paul is overcome by emotion at the summit and hugs the Sherpas. But he and the other vintners can't stay long, because the longer they stay, the higher the temperatures rise. When you reach the summit, you're less than halfway there. They need to descend to base camp with the grapes, crush them, and make wine. Before starting the journey down, Paul invites his Sherpa to stand next to him for a selfie. Paul looked at his phone at the selfie he took and saw a picture of himself with Rodrigo. He woke up, alarmed he had overslept harvest morning, and realized he was dreaming. The harvest was 13 days away, and there was much to do. 90% of winemaking is preparation. Carrie Ann pulled all the containers, buckets, lugs, and pick bins out of her storage shed, rinsed and soaked them in SO2, sulfur dioxide, infused water to clean them, while Sheila dusted and vacuumed the house as Paul hosed down their containers. Not content to rest after every corner of her house had been vacuumed and scrubbed, she asked Paul to vacuum the vineyard. Normally, he would have said she was nuts, but he knew she wanted everything clean on her property, so he bit his tongue to avoid a fight before harvest, and the vineyard was clean as Christmas after Paul blew every leaf, twig, and dried weed off the paths. It was August 20th, and Paul had cut water to the vines to encourage ripening. The sugars were rising steadily, and the Tempranillo would be ready in less than 2 weeks, the rest of the vineyard in mid-September. Then it struck. A massive heat wave with temperatures exceeding 100 degrees, and while Paul had kept a close eye on the Tempranillo, which he expected to harvest first, he had ignored measuring the Zinfandel, whose sugars shot up with the heat, transforming plump grapes into raisins and prunes. He sampled 60 berries to measure the sugars. 27 bricks. Too high! This calls for an emergency landing. No time for picking party. No time to invite the bishop to bless the harvest crew. No time to be the perfect host to Mary France's daughter visiting from France, who had arrived for a relaxing vacation. Since the French are the kings of wine, they ought to be good pickers. He sent out SOS and Mayday calls to neighbors, begging them to please arrive at dawn, the better to start early, before the heat of the day. Merlot Matt said he'd bring the gator. Great! But called back later to say he had promised to make sandwiches for the tea ladies and could only come for an hour. Shit. Carrie Ann was harvesting her own grapes and couldn't help. How are we going to get these grapes picked? At midnight, Paul sent an email to the bishop requesting a remote vineyard blessing and pledging to the church a tithe from the harvest, and he and Bluey hiked into the vineyard holding a solar-powered accent light, banging the ground with a shovel to clear away rattlesnakes, out cooling themselves and catching dinner. The two worked an hour, Paul doing the picking while Bluey held the light, gathering all of 50 pounds. Paul felt like a defender at the Alamo. He needed reinforcements, but who to call at 1 a.m.? At dawn, as he and Bluey prepared to re-enter the vineyard while the rest of the household slept, Snake Man arrived. "Sorry I'm late. I got your message last night after getting back from deep sea fishing." "You are a cavalry and savior. Good to see you. Welcome aboard." Paul saluted him and gave him a quick lesson in grape picking 101. Rule 1, don't clip your finger, then sent him on his mission. Then a pair of neighbors arrived. Paul hugged them, grateful for assistance. Sheila awoke from her slumber, quickly assessed the situation, and said, "I'm calling Miguel." "You're what?" "You hate him." "It doesn't matter. You can't do this by yourself. I need more people." "All right, I'll call him," said Paul. So Paul dialed Miguel, who takes Sundays off. "Que puta madre me esa lama de esa hora?" "You're always telling me to call you to send over a couple of guys, so here's the call." Miguel gave him Rodrigo's number. Paul called Rodrigo, who was willing to help, and arrived at 8 with a friend. At that moment, Paul knew he was saved. Then Merlot Matt arrived, wearing a sleeveless yellow tank top. "Why do you always wear muscle shirts when picking?" Paul asked. "I might get lucky," Mac replied. They were making progress, and the grapes were filling the bins, and the bins were stacking up. Since their vineyard was on a steep hillside, they slid containers down the hill like sleds. As temperatures rose, the work slowed, and Paul feared they would have to stop with only half the grapes picked, since Mac went home to make sandwiches for the tea ladies. Paul looked up to the sky to pray for a miracle, and saw a mirage. Carrie-Anne and Stephanie standing on a ridge, with clippers and empty buckets. "We're here!" they yelled. "I never expected to see both of you," said Paul, especially Steph, who avoided vineyard work, but couldn't resist champagne. Just then, John arrived in his mechanical mule to haul grapes from the furthest corner of the vineyard to the crush pad, and for the second time that day, Paul felt saved. Even the French guest appeared and picked a bucket, but soon retreated inside to escape the oppressive heat. Carrie-Anne continued picking, while Steph carried a bucket down to the garage and entered the kitchen to organize food. "I don't feel so good," Carrie-Anne said. "What's the matter?" Paul asked. "It feels like the time I ran the rock and roll marathon and passed out." "But you're in good shape," Paul insisted. "I'm going to throw up." "You have heat sickness. Let's get you inside." He escorted her down the hill, supporting her with his right arm, while carrying a 23-pound bucket of grapes with his left hand. When they reached the house, Paul alerted Steph. "I'm going to throw up," she repeated, and Paul slid the bucket of grapes in front of her as she kneeled, emptied her stomach, and collapsed on the tile floor, hitting her head, pulling Paul down on top of her. "She's suffering from heat stroke," Paul said, holding her in his arms. "Sheila, call 911. Steph, bring an ice pack. We need to cool her down." "This happened when we ran the rock and roll marathon," Steph said. "She's going to be all right." Carrie-Anne regained consciousness before Sheila hung up with the emergency operator. "I'm okay," she said, "just an upset stomach." "Rest," said Paul, holding a baggie filled with ice on her head. "We have to finish picking the grapes," she said, trying to stand. "You sit and rest, and we'll take care of the grapes," said Paul. And Carrie-Anne, delirious, had a premonition as Paul knelt next to her, holding ice on her head with one hand, and her hand with the other. "I need someone to look after me when I'm older." "Sorry I ruined your grapes," she apologized after a few minutes. "No worries," replied Paul. "I was thinking of making Throw Up Chuck. That'll sell if you price it $1.99 a bottle and put a nice label on it." And with that, Paul knew she was out of danger, left her in Steph's care, and went back outside to finish picking the last row with Rodrigo, which John ferried to the garage. Rodrigo lifted and emptied the 60-pound bins into the crusher to stemmer, and the crushing went fast. Paul couldn't have done it alone, and was grateful for assistance. It wasn't well planned, but they survived their first harvest. There would be more. As for Carrie-Anne's harvest, she recruited volunteers in advance, leaving nothing to chance, and wrote detailed battle plans describing each task volunteers were to perform. That evening, as temperatures cooled and with everyone recuperated, they gathered at Steph's for dinner, and Sheila stood to make an announcement. I want to buy tons of grapes this year, showing clear symptoms of crazy winemaker's disease. Who's going to make the wine? Asked Paul. I will, Sheila insisted. Are you crazy? I will if I want to. I want to make a lot of wine this year. Don't stop me. He couldn't argue. Call Mick and order a ton of Nebbiolo and 1,000 pounds of Montepulciano from Guadalupe. How about Alianico? Yes, that too. The next day, Paul got on the phone, left messages, and sent emails, and was surprised to receive confirmations for his orders. Merlot Matt called. How much Merlot do you want this year? We've got so many grapes coming in, I don't know what to do. That's fine. We have too many buyers and not enough grapes, but I wanted to give you a first shot. Sheila interrupted. Tell Mac I want 1 ton of Merlot. Paul obliged. A few days later, Paso Robles Bill called. Do you want any Paso grapes this year? Now Paul was starting to show signs of the disease and ordered a ton of Paso grapes, along with Cayenne. The next day, Merlot Matt called with an invitation to go to Valley Center to pick some Petit Syrah grapes, one of their favorite varietals. Paul asked, Do you want me to drive up there to test the grapes before harvest? No need to. The owner tested them and says they're 24 bricks. We pick Sunday morning. Sunday? I won't be here. I need to go to Texas on business. Sheila said, I can do it. Well, you'll have to, said Paul, because I'll be out of town. Be careful what you wish for. So with Paul gone, the household's strong women harvested the grapes and kept blocks of ice frozen in 5-gallon water containers on the must until he returned. The first thing he did after hugging Bluey was test the grapes, which were 21.5 bricks. I should emphasize only 21.5 bricks. You don't make bold, kick-ass, award-winning California wine with low-sugar grapes. Paul was disappointed, but only had himself to blame. Oh well, I'll blend it with other wine and it'll be fine, vowing to himself. I'll never purchase grapes again without testing myself. Crazy lady winemaker's disease starts with planting a few vines or making a small batch of wine from a kid. The next symptom is planting an acre or more. The next stage is when you put a 40-foot cargo container in your front yard to hold your barrels. According to the Centers for Disease Control, it has been found to mutate and cross genders. Midway through the season, over the hump, Paul reached the point where he'd had about enough all the grape picking and pressing he needed for inner peace, when Steph called and asked, Would you like our Brunello? Without hesitation, he said yes and told Sheila the news. Steph and Cayenne had negotiated a contract with Janet's for Joe's famed Brunello. We're not supposed to call it Brunello, even though it is the exact genetic clone of the Sangiovese grape used in that part of Italy, or the Italian Carabarnili, or will descend upon our neighborhood, confiscate the counterfeit goods, and burn Joe's vineyard. Sheila named the wine Blunello after her dog. After all the effort they put into negotiating the purchase agreement, after all the awards Cayenne and Steph had won making wine from those grapes in the past, why would the girls suddenly give it up? Was their tension fermenting beneath their smiles? Were hours of back-breaking winemaking fueling a quarrel? Was their long-term friendship being tested? Were there sour grapes? Warning signs were there, but these two grape gals had been friends too long to let a little spoiled grape juice come between them. A batch of wine might turn into vinegar, but not their friendship. In the end, Steph wasn't prepared to dedicate her life to the grape to the extent of Cayenne, so she began to pull back, passing the baton of her grapes to Sheila, who was stepping up, or delirious from the disease. The grandest harvest party at all, San Diego County, was at Joe's estate, where 150 volunteers assembled at 7 a.m. on the Sunday of Labor Day weekend for a toast of sparkling white wine, a quick lesson in Grape Picking 101, and grape cultural education. The Soviet state of California had taken an interest in the labor rights of its citizen workers. The Commissar of Labor issued a decree prohibiting volunteers from assisting at wineries unless paid the prevailing livable wage. "Fuck that," said Joe, who rebanded the activity an educational outing and contacted a state representative to squash the dubious decree. He also pressed her to pass legislation changing the state's gun laws to allow the Minutemen Border Patrol he supported to carry assault rifles. "This is a clipper," said Joe, "and this is your finger. May the two never meet in our vineyard." "Amen," rejoined the crowd. "Only men are dumb enough to cut themselves," Sheila whispered to Steph, who had made a great sacrifice to interrupt her beauty sleep to be in the vineyard at 7 a.m. "We're more careful." "And we can talk and pick at the same time," Steph added. "If you sever your finger," continued Joe, "pick it up and put it on ice. Don, where's Don?" he called, and Don raised his hand. "Don's a veterinarian, and he'll sew the finger back onto your hand. Hopefully you'll be able to stop barking when he's done. If you see a raisin, it's a sugar pill that will improve the wine's flavor. Put it in the bucket," said Joe. "Try to keep leaves out of the buckets and pick everything you see that looks good. We have a team of quality control experts who will inspect every grape before it goes into the crusher." Joe raised his glass, and the assembled raised their plastic cups, while Janet drank from a hidden bottle of Dom Perignon. "May you have fun, be safe, and let the harvest begin!" Cheers! And the herd hurried down their glasses, picked up buckets and clippers, and headed into the vines like a swarm of locusts. Within 30 minutes, John proved Sheila correct by snipping his finger. Fortunately, he didn't need the medic. The best cut at Blue Merle occurred when Paul's father was picking a row of vines on safe, relatively flat terrain so he wouldn't roll down the mountain. Paul noticed purple stains on his father's shirt. No worries about that. Then bright red stains on his father's white bucket. "What happened?" Paul asked. "I cut my finger." "Are you all right?" "Yes." "How did you do that?" "I was cutting this bunch of grapes and nicked my finger, and as the cluster fell, I reached for it with the clippers and cut my hand again." "Did Mom teach you no double dipping?" "Congratulations on the first double cut in the history of this area." With his father on blood thinners, Paul suggested he get out of the vineyard and grill the tri-tip. The wine made from those grapes was good, and every time Paul served it at family events, he recalled the double clutch bloodshed. Joe's harvest was a social high point of the year for many attendees, as Joe opened his wine cellar, to the consternation of Janet, who tried to cut costs and even suggested substituting fish bait for the caviar decorating the canopies, saying, "They'll be too drunk to notice." It was the pinnacle of country living and one of the last bastions of free love for San Diegans. Relationships, even marriages, sparked between singles who met between the rows. A gal might walk up to a guy and ask, "May I pick with you?" While a guy might ask a gal with a heavy bucket of grapes at her feet, "May I carry that for you?" Then they would chat while picking and discover common interest, and a bottle of wine later, new friendships were sealed under the olive trees with promises. And lest anyone forget the venue's mantra proclaimed by an illustrated sign at the top of the vineyard, 0 to naked in 1.2 bottles of wine. Bacchus and Venus ruled for a day, and Miguel picked panties and thongs from the vineyard floor the next morning. Joe's residence overlooks a picture-perfect vineyard and magnificent valley below. The rows are immaculate without weeds. Granite or limestone rocks circle the base of vines. The house's backyard features a flat Bacchus and Venus ruled for a day, and Miguel picked panties and thongs from the vineyard floor the next morning. Joe's residence overlooks a picture-perfect vineyard and magnificent valley below. The rows are immaculate without weeds. Granite or limestone rocks circle the bases of vines. The house's backyard features a flat dining area surrounded by rose gardens. A polished Maserati shines in his driveway, an accessory for the Italian varietals he grows. He built a cellar into the hill to keep his wines at constant temperature, where guests escape the rising heat. Picking grapes here is a Tuscan holiday. Bluey loved the harvest and followed the women, not just to savor their aromas, but waiting for them to spill their buckets so he could scoop up a cluster, addictive as opiates and as deadly. He didn't care, or he waited below for grapes to roll into his mouth. Paul let him play this game until he caught his first grape, then sternly called his name. But the dog wouldn't budge. If the harvest were at his property, he'd pick Bluey up and carry him over his shoulder, as he had Kate and Alex when they had blow-up meltdown tantrums as children, and lock him behind the iron gates in the French terrace where he could observe the action and visit pickers when they came for shade and refreshments. Miguel, wearing a freshly ironed patch over his eye, was commander of the gator during harvest, driving it as his own. He slammed on the brakes and skidded to 1 foot behind Paul's knee. "Que pasa, amigo?" he called. "Amigo, my ass, ¿cómo está?" "Okay, how's your wine selling?" "Okay. Have you talked to Joe lately? He's selling a lot of wine." "So I heard." "Why don't you sell your wine to restaurants?" "I don't have time. I have to work for a living, unlike some people." Miguel ducked the jab. "If you don't have no time to sell your wine, I know a guy who can sell it for you." "No, thank you." "You should get a tasting room." "So you can build it for me?" "No, thank you." "You have a lot of money." "I had a lot of money and spent it all on wine, women, and you, Don Pirata. I gave you all my money and now my vineyard wiring is falling apart." "You should let me come over and fix it." "So you can take more money?" "Gracias, no." A picking vineyardista passing in the pathway accidentally butted her butt against Paul's. "Good morning," he said to her with a smile. "Let's do that dance again, the vineyard bump." She giggled, returned the smile, and walked by as Paul admired her vineyard sway. Anything could happen in a vineyard harvest day, with such an amicable mixture of women and wine, men and grapes. He closed his eyes and inhaled the currents of her wake, and wondered what scent his winemaking muse, 3,000 miles away, was wearing. "Show you around. They got a lot of pretty senoritas there, prettier than her," he said, motioning to the dream who just passed. "When Trump is elected president, he'll give you a free ride back to Tijuana." "Puta madre," he spat. You could spot the gringas from the migrants. American ladies wore short sleeves and either short pants or yoga tights, while the experienced vineyard workers wore long sleeves, long, loose dresses, and wide-brimmed hats to protect their skin from the sun. They wore bandanas to guard the back of their necks and sides of their faces. They respected the sun. "How's your knee?" Paul asked. "It's pretty good. I can walk up and down the hills again. I'm gonna get the other one fixed after harvest season. Then I can come over and work for you." "That must have cost a lot of money." "No, it was almost free with Medicare." "I give you all my money and now I have to pay for your health care with my taxes? You should pay taxes and pay your people fairly, pirata." Paul bit into one of the grapes. It wasn't sweet. He looked at the seeds and they were green. He pulled a berry from another cluster. It tasted tart. "Hey, Miguel, what are the bricks? These grapes don't taste very ripe." "That's not my job. You need to ask Joe." A helicopter circled the vineyard. A volunteer who lived in an apartment downtown asked, "What's that?" "Water police," answered Paul. "They're looking for water hogs." He said to Miguel, "Hey, amigo, those vines look pretty green and the clusters are really big. How much water did you cut back?" "About 5%. 5% this week?" he asked, surprised but not surprised. The mandate was 35%. "We cut our water 50%. No wonder these green grapes aren't ripe. The water police are going to get you." "The fucking water police can go fuck themselves. Your vines look like shit. You should let me come over and take care of your vines. I'll make them green. You keep your hands off our vines. Our grapes taste good. That helicopter is after you, man." "It's not my fault," said Miguel. "It's Janet. She won't let Joe cut the water." "If the water police don't get you, it'll be immigration. You should pay your people more so they don't rat on you." "You should mind your own fucking business." And with that, Miguel pressed the accelerator of the gator, shouting, out of my way as he pulled away. You should mind your own fucking business. And with that, Miguel pressed the accelerator of the gator, shouting, "Out of my way!" And as he pulled away, he admonished one of his crew for taking a moment's break to sip water as temperatures rose. "Hey! Stop looking at the senoritas and get back to work." "Si, patron," replied Pedro, cursing under his breath. "Hijo de puta," as Miguel sped away down the hill. "That son of a bitch riding around like a big shot. I'd like to teach him a lesson." Rodrigo lifted 100-pound containers of Brunello clone grapes into the gator, and Miguel drove the cargo to the shaded crush pad, where another day laborer set them on a scale as Janet counted every pound. Miguel sauntered to an ice cooler for the guests, grabbed a beer, and took a long drink as the locusts worked their way uphill, picking 10 tons of grapes, one bunch at a time, with a covey of Guatemalan women he assembled, paying them half the minimum wage and pocketing the rest, diligently inspected each and every berry under Janet's watchful eyes before sending the perfect ones to the crusher and the damaged ones to the compost. Volunteers wilted as temperatures rose above 90 Fahrenheit degrees, and some began complaining. "When are we going to eat?" while others mumbled, "Let's eat now." "They can't stop until we're finished," Janet said to Joe. She picked up a megaphone and announced, "There's plenty of food and drink when you're done." Joe sensed a rebellion brewing and told her, "They're not slaves." He took the megaphone and urged anyone tired to take a break and stay hydrated, and promised they would stop in an hour with a feast for all and an open wine bar. At the crush pad, Paul found Carrie Ann assisting with quality control, picking stems out of the must. On her haunches, bent over a container of grape must in a bikini top. Perhaps it was the mean genes of his father's family that caused him to press a cluster of grapes on her head, shampooing her golden locks. She threw the stems in her hands at him. He splashed a handful of grape juice onto her cougar. A food fight with grapes was on. "I'm going to wrestle you like a gator," she said, pulling him into a macro bin where she tried to take him down into the juice. He reached down with his hands and splashed her like kids playing in a pool, and for a moment they were just kids. Their wet, slippery, slimy, joyful, fun fight of grapes was short-lived, but never forgotten. Sheila paid Janet, while Paul filled their cars with containers of grape must, making 2 round trips. After dumping the must into the fermenter at home, Paul measured the sugar and wasn't surprised when the reading was only 22 bricks. Once again, he had only himself to blame for not measuring the grapes before picking. Oh well, the grape fight with Carrie Ann was worth it, and I'll blend the wine with other wines and make a super Tuscan. Bluey staggered over to Paul and threw up a dark-colored soup of half-digested grapes. Bluey was a grape fiend, and although Sheila enrolled him in a 12-step grape anonymous program at PetSmart, he fell off the wagon at Joe's. Grapes for a dog are like rat poison for a human. Paul thought Bluey was a goner and drove him to the pet hospital. Who knew the trade-off for making some of the finest wine in the country is the death of your dog? We live in a dream world, planting vineyards, picking grapes, making wine, and then your dog, who'd rather chew grapes than fillet, is in the emergency room. Carrie Ann and Steph are screeching at each other louder than 2 female cougars in heat, Steph muttering, "She has to have this, she has to have that." I read a story about a couple in Napa living the life in winemaking country, and the whole thing ends in divorce, with cases of unsold wine filling every corner of their house to the ceiling. I always say, the family that makes wine together sticks together. This isn't easy. Nothing's ever easy. Tensions can rip relationships apart. Maybe I should say, the family that makes wine together and sticks together can stick through anything. Bluey started recovering the moment Paul carried him into the emergency room, and tests showed his kidneys were still functioning. Paul paid the bill, and Bluey walked back to the car on his own. Carrie Ann and Steph patched things up, and the gal from Napa who lost her winery to divorce bounced back and wrote a best-selling book about the experience. Next up were the Guadalupe grapes, grown by Camilo, which have yielded some of the best Nebbiolo in the New World. Sheila arranged for delivery to her winery. Paul plucked a berry from a fat bunch and tasted. Salty. He called Mick, who organized the shipment, to ask about the grapes. "They're always salty," Mick explained, adding, "You've become a super taster with the ability to discern salt and minerality. Next time, why not hire me as your official taster before buying the grapes? I swear I never tasted a hint of salt in the Dream 2006 vintage." "It was there," Mick said, and Paul remembered he couldn't taste as well then. "Oh well," Paul said. "Sweet grapes, salty grapes, but never sour grapes. We really appreciate everything you've done for us and all your support." Paul went ahead and made the wine, and it came out pretty good, and some customers insisted it was their favorite. Go figure. When Paso Robles Bill arrived with an 18-wheeler packed with macro bins covered with dry ice, everything was organized more precisely than a Swiss watch, with Sheila supervising and Rodrigo and Miguel ready to unload the grapes with a pitchfork directly into the crusher destemmer. Paul trusted Bill's judgment about the numbers and quality of the fruit, as he was a meticulous winemaker who graduated from the amateur ranks of San Diego to make his reputation in Paso. After finishing quickly at the Blue Merle, they all headed to Cougar Winery to assist Carrie Ann unload and crush her Paso grapes. Carrie Ann asked Paul for help separating two stock buckets. They grabbed opposite ends on the buckets and sang in unison, "Twist and shout," twisting them free while dancing the twist. Come on, baby now, twist and shout." They shoveled and pitchfork grapes from the truck at the bottom of Carrie Ann's driveway into the crusher destemmer and wheeled the juice up the driveway into her garage. A nearby band struck up a rendition of My Way. "Who's having a party?" Paul asked. "Joe's son is getting married," said the Cougar. "What? Joe's son is getting married? Miguel, what are you doing here? Weren't you invited?" asked Paul. "No," he answered. "You should be over there celebrating. You practically built that estate. If the Godfather could welcome Luca Brasi to his daughter's wedding, why didn't Joe the wino invite Miguel to his son's?" Family is family, and even if we weren't related, we always felt like we were family, planting vines, tending the vineyard, picking grapes with Joe, drinking wine and joking about getting naked after 1.2 bottles of wine. Mi casa es su casa, amigo. The pace slowed as Paul reached into the bin to pick leaves from the pile, and Miguel complained Paul was slacking. Paul trusted Rodrigo as he thrust the pitchfork near his hands and eyes, forking grapes directly into the crusher destemmer while Carrie Ann supervised. She looked away a second to apply lavender balm to her lips, as a 32-gallon container on wheels filled with grape juice, grape must, demonstrated Newton's laws of physics overcoming inertia and the force of friction to accelerate down her driveway. Rodrigo leapt from the truck with the exclamations in Spanish none of the gringos understood and put himself between the breakaway container of juice and a ravine and kept it from spilling. Whew! The runaway container was a clue to a mystery. How was Sheila, an inexperienced winemaker, able to extract 77 gallons of new wine from 1,000 pounds of Nebbiolo grapes not knowing how to use the ratchet press, while Carrie Ann, an Amazon with the power to press stronger than Miguel, barely got 60 gallons from the same amount of grapes? Was Carrie Ann short-shipped, or did a container of juice roll down the hill into a ditch? The band played on. This time, I Don't Get No Satisfaction, with Paul picking leaves, Rodrigo pitchforking, and Miguel drinking a Corona. And for the third time in 4 weeks, Paul heard Spanish expressions he didn't fully comprehend. "What's the matter?" he asked Rodrigo. "What's the matter?" he asked Rodrigo. "A yellow jack has stung me." "No big deal," interjected Miguel. "I got stung so many times yesterday." "It's okay, no problem," said Rodrigo. "Miguel, you deserved it," Paul said, but not Rodrigo, sticking up for his friend. Finally, The pick bins were empty, and the grapes converted to slushy juice and skins. "Mira," Miguel called to Paul. "Help me with this fucking thing." "What's the matter? Can't you push it uphill by yourself?" Paul grabbed an edge of the container to assist, and a yellow jacket landed on his left pinky, and for the first time in his life he let fly a Spanish expletive he learned a moment before. "¿Qué pasó?" asked Miguel. "I just got stung by a bee that was aiming for you." "You deserve it." "Why?" "Because you said I deserved it." Paul detected beneath the black patch a rough veneer. He had hurt Miguel's feelings. A complaining, no-good, cheating, son of a bitch pirate with feelings. Paul realized Miguel was right. He did deserve it. "Mi amigo," said Paul, taking Miguel's hand and shaking it. "When my daughter gets married, I'm inviting you to the wedding, but only if you behave yourself, you rascal." Carrie-Anne asked Paul if she could borrow Rodrigo to help her clean up, and Paul was glad to let him assist her. He hopped into the truck to move it out of the way, and Paul told her, if you drove a truck into town, you could catch any man." "It is my pickup truck, you know," she said, batting her eyes. When Rodrigo returned home, he complained to his wife he was treated without respect because Carrie-Anne should have asked him if he wanted to work for her, not Paul, who wasn't his master. "I told you, you have to quit that job," Rosa said. "There's better work that pays more." When Paul returned home, he greeted Bluey with a hug and measured the grapes, and found the Paso Robles grapes were overripe, with high pH, over 4, high Brix, and low acid, which suited him fine, because it's what he needed to balance the underripe fruit he vinted, proving once again, good wine is made in the vineyard, and great wine by blending. That evening, Sheila and Paul invited the other neighborhood winemakers over to catch their breaths and relax a bit as the sun set behind Catalina Island. For the 5th time since Michelle Obama became First Lady and was proud of America, Paul was even more proud of Sheila, who had become a winemaker. She supervises several crushes and presses by herself, and even caught her first gopher, although he was asked to dispatch the rotting carcass after she left it in the trap 2 weeks. "Next, if only I could teach you how to rack wine and bottle, I'd be home free," he told her. "If you show me how, I'll do it." "Follow me," Paul said to everyone. "I want to show you something." Under the orange amber light of a rising harvest moon, following the same path he and Bluey took when they picked the first grapes under moonlight 28 days earlier, he led everyone to a spot where he affixed a ceramic tile of a blue moon onto the retaining wall, where they sat and drank wine like water, admiring the moon wine. Paul turned to Carrie-Anne and asked, "Hey, Cougar, are you going to Canada in a few months?" "Why?" "They've got grapes up there in winter to make ice wine. I'm buying my ticket as soon as I get home." The maddening crush season was almost over, and Paul was thinking never again. But that's the funny thing about crazy winemaker disease. It goes into remission until the next harvest season, then erupts with a vengeance. There was only one more block for Sheila and Paul to harvest, the Grenache, and this one he would relish, his favorite grapes, his favorite area of the vineyard. Good wine is made by the feet of noble maidens, while fine wine is made with grapes pressed by their breasts, and as Paul had every intention to make fine wine from the last block of grapes, he invited Marcy to the year's final harvest.